Welcome. I'm Eric Brewer in the CS department in high school, I guess ERG also, and I have to get to do the introductions. We have a few news items for today. First, as you might have noticed, there's food. Everything except the aluminum is compostable, so there's compost stuff set in the back, and if you have trouble, Jason, who's back there somewhere, will help you, so please do that. Two upcoming events, the kickoff for Big Ideas. It's a contest at Berkeley is taking place next Thursday, a week from tomorrow, with speaker John Seeley Brown, who knows quite a bit about innovation. He'll be here 12:30 a week from tomorrow, same room. And then on Monday the 22nd, a week from Monday, Berkeley's own Boris Rubinsky is going to be talking about bioengineering advances and their relationship to disadvantaged societies. That will be in the new Blum building across the street, across the path, I guess, at 4 p.m. on Monday. This room number's B100, but it's the new Blum Hall right across. I've known Kentaro for
6 or
7 years, and I get some blame and credit for getting him into this space. Maybe he regrets that now, although I don't think so. And so he's learned quite a bit in that time. Will tell us a bunch of that today. He was I guess, PhD from Yale, I guess, or so. Yes, and then went to Microsoft, worked on various non-development things, co-founded Microsoft's lab in Bangalore to work on technology and development. I did a lot of great projects there, where I think a lot of this insight comes from. And then is now a visiting scholar at the iSchool to kind of capture the thoughts he's had over these years. So welcome, Kentaro.
Thanks. Thank you, Eric. And thanks to CITRIS for hosting. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to all of you for coming. So when I was first asked to do this talk a few months ago, there was a talk that I used to give then that was called 10 Myths for Technology and Development. And then as I gave those talks, I found that 10 was a little bit tedious. So I've cut it down. And so you're only going to get 5 of them, but hopefully they'll be the right 5. I used to work in India. This is the lab where we used to work. If you talk to many Indian people in the United States, they often tell you that it's not true that there are cows on the road, but in fact, there are cows on the road. The lab itself is overall is a computer science lab, so it was engaged in a lot of different kinds of computer science research. But the group that I ran was particularly interested in finding ways to use computing technology for socioeconomic development of very poor communities. So I'm going to give you an example of the kind of project that we worked on. This is relatively recent work that was taking place when I was still there and has gone on since I left. So some of you may be familiar with Microcredit. The idea is that you give loans to very poor people, very small loans, and that they're usually group structures that kind of act as collateral for individuals and apply peer pressure to individuals so that they're able to pay the loans back. Most of microcredit happens in what are called self-help groups of one kind or another, and they'll have regular meetings where clients will pay back their loans, get new loans, and as you can see from this photograph, there's a whole lot of bookkeeping that needs to happen, and almost all of it is still done on paper. Paper turns out to be very practical, useful, it's cheap, and the people who are engaged in microcredit, both the clients as well as the loan officers, really like it because it is, it's something visible. And even people who are illiterate will often say that they want to be able to have some physical token that an exchange has happened. They want to be able to point to something real. They don't want all of this information stored in electronic format where they will themselves never actually see it. So paper is very critical. And this is one example of the kind of record bookkeeping that might actually happen in a microcredit meeting. And I want to highlight that these records are often relatively sloppy. So there are situations where numbers are hard to read. This actually was written down initially as 20, and then it was corrected, and then it was recorrected. It's supposed to be 20, but it looks like 200. And then over there, you can see a case where the numbers are not clearly written within a particular framework. And so this is a twofold problem. It's a problem if you want to ultimately digitize this information, in that even a human data entry professional will have trouble with this kind of data. And if you actually want to do this automatically so that you don't have to have human beings doing this, it's incredibly difficult to read. So we used a prototype device that was developed by a different group at Microsoft at the time. And this is basically an electronic slate where you can write on a regular sheet of paper with a special pen that, and a special electronic backing such that everything that you write ultimately gets recorded as strokes. You can then do digit recognition, handwriting recognition, and actually provide some amount of feedback in real time. Okay? So it allows you to maintain the paper aspect of everything, but also digitize on the spot. We ran quite a few different trials with this. Here's a photograph where you can see people using the same form that they're used to and writing records and keeping records. But there's also a little digital component as well as speakers such that you can hear audio feedback of what's being written down and so on and so forth. Now, this particular project is going to be presented next month at a conference called ICTD in London. And I don't really want to give away all of the content, but these are a sample of the results, and I'm also not going to go into that in great detail because the important thing is that overall the system is faster, cheaper, and more accurate. Okay, so this is very typical of successful projects in this space where you use some kind of technology to enhance something for the sake of relatively poor communities. At Microsoft Research in India, we ran probably tens of these kinds of projects. I think somewhere between 30 and 40 such projects. Some of them were successful in the sense that they got results like the ones I just showed. Some of them were unsuccessful in that we were not able to get positive results. And then some of them were further successful in the sense that they went on to actually influence other groups doing similar things or that wanted this kind of technology. And then some of them never went very far. And one of the things that I've been doing a lot since I left is to think about what accounted for the successful projects in the sense of ultimately having impact beyond the research experiments that we did in the lab, and which ones were the projects that didn't go anywhere. And so what I'm going to suggest is that there's a certain pattern to those. Before I get to that, let me also mention that this kind of research is happening all over the world now. UC Berkeley, the TIER group here is a significant contributor to work like this. There are other efforts both at universities in the United States as well as in industry, in government, in multilateral organizations like the World Bank, the UN, and so forth. And it's led to a certain amount of hype in the rhetoric. Okay, so here are some quotes by very prominent people in this field. And let me just read them out to you. Kids in the developing world need the newest technology. There is a pressing need to employ information technology for rural healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa. Can the cell phone help end global poverty? And the internet should be a human right in and of itself. Okay, so this is the kind of language that people used to use when they're talking about water and sanitation or nutrition or healthcare, and it's being applied to what is ultimately a certain kind of electronic technology. All right, so at this point, let me talk about the myths. And I'm going to make this a little bit interactive. So I'm going to present 5 myths, but they're each going to have a question for you. Okay, so first one. Okay, imagine you and a very poor farmer from a remote village somewhere are each given the task to raise as much money as possible within a fixed span of time, let's say a week, okay? And you're each given complete free access to an email account to do that. Okay, no restraint on how you use the email account. It's entirely up to you. Who do you think would be able to raise more money? Okay, who thinks you would? Okay, who thinks the very poor farmer would? Okay, so more hands went up for you. Okay, who can tell me why you said you would be able to raise more money? Give me some reasons for why. Eric. You know wealthy people. Very good.
Because I'm not the only one I know with the email account.
You're not the only one, right? So you have a lot of friends with email accounts. Good. What else? Anybody else?
It's not even sure that the poor rural farmer in India would be literate.
That's right. So the farmer may not even be literate. Okay, good. Sometimes they're literate, but they don't have a lot of experience writing messages, writing emails, so they wouldn't be able to write a message that would really be persuasive. I would also add that most of you probably have more organizational capacity. Like you would actually be able to get your friends to be involved in trying to help raise money and so on and so forth. So what's interesting about this thought experiment is that the technology is identical. Okay, you both have access to an email account, but the result is completely different, and it's completely different for the reason that is intrinsic to you, right? It's people you know, the education that you have, the capacities that you have. So one of the things that you often hear in this area is that technology counteracts the phenomenon of rich people getting richer, of smart people getting smarter, of educated people being more educated. And what I'm suggesting is that that is just not the case. Other ways that you hear this phrase often is that the internet democratizes things. It democratizes access to information. It democratizes access to publication, and so on and so forth. Another phrase is the world is flat. There's actually been some work in different fields, in mass media, in politics, and in education that suggests that what's really happening with technology is that technology amplifies people's fundamental capacity to get things done, right? So if you're already able to do fundraising, then having an email account will certainly help you. But it doesn't add to that capacity. It doesn't substitute for that capacity. So if you're fundamentally not able to do those things, it doesn't really matter how much technology you have. Okay, so that's the first myth. And I apologize for this numbering. I used to have 10 myths, and then it grew to 12 myths. And I've kept the numbering, but I've decided to pick and choose depending on the talk. Okay, next series of questions. Each of these is a yes or no. Raise your hand if you believe any of these. Okay, number one, are you as rich as you'd like to be? Who's raising their hand? Anybody? Okay, are you as educated as you'd like to be? Okay, I'm only raising my hand for demonstration purposes, not because I believe these things. Okay, number three, are you as compassionate as you'd like to be? Okay, very few hands went up to all of those questions, and I don't think anybody raised their hand for all three. I'm going to argue that you have all of the information you need to accomplish these things. Okay, everybody in this room. Okay, because you have access to an internet account. So, for example, if you Google how to be rich, you get 41 million hits. Okay, and not all of those pages are crank postings about how to do this. As far as education goes, these days a lot of universities have put up their teaching materials. The MIT system is particularly famous, so you can get lectures, you can get quizzes, you can get problem sets, you can get solution sets, right? If you really were willing to go through all of that, you could get an engineering degree from MIT. Okay, and as far as compassion goes, the Dalai Lama has 7 practices you can engage in to increase your level of compassion, right? All of this information is already online, okay? So the question is, what is keeping you from being these things, given that nobody answered that they were as rich, educated, or as kind as they would like to be? Okay, so think about that for a little bit. I'm going to suggest that this is no different for people who are very poor. It's true that they often are missing the information that they need to accomplish certain things, but it's not just information. They're also missing time. They're missing, they often have a hard day at work and certainly don't have the energy to keep studying afterwards. In addition, they're missing a lot more things. They're missing a lot of transport infrastructure. They're missing the economic capability to follow through, and so on and so forth. Sometimes people say that information is the bottleneck for a poor farmer to become more productive on his farm. And again, what I'm saying is that information is one of many pieces that you need, but it's certainly not enough to just provide information. Again, technology magnifies the intent that people have based on what it is that they really want to do with their lives. So I'm going to investigate this point again a little bit further with the next question. Okay, let's say you won the lottery and you got 20% of your annual income, except that you have to spend it on one of these 3 things. Okay, this is forced choice, multiple choice. The first one is a part-time personal assistant, B is travel and tourism, and C is an iPad or another gadget. Okay, who would choose a personal assistant? Okay, a few hands, maybe 4 or 5. B, who would choose travel and tourism? Okay, a lot more hands, maybe 50, 60. Okay, who would choose an iPad or another gadget? Okay, a couple of hands. All right, so let me just say that B won in this particular contest. Now, I've had some occasional minor interactions with Bill Gates, and it turns out that Bill Gates has an army of personal assistants. Okay, now compared to him, we are incredibly poor, right? If we went to Bill and said, look, Bill, I really want to become wealthy, wealthy like you. What do you think I should do with this extra money I have? He would say, well, you should certainly pour it into productivity, right? Why go, do anything as frivolous as go on a trip to Europe when you could get a personal assistant and get more time for yourself to do the things that you really want to do? And that's the same logic that we apply when we go to very poor communities and try to understand what people need in those communities. So we'll say, look, here's this very poor person. They are not spending enough money on their health care. Their children have diarrhea every other month. And why is it that they don't spend more money on health care? They ought to, because it's obviously very important. And one thing that's interesting is that in all of these idea of people doing needs assessments, especially of cultures that are foreign to their own, you're often applying the standards of your own and what you think of as a need to that other location. So needs analysis inevitably reveal that people need better healthcare, better education, better employment, and so on and so forth, all of which is true at one level. But when you look at what people actually spend on, you see things that look frivolous from the outside. So in particular in technology, people spend on ringtones. They'll spend a considerable sum of money on changing their ringtones, an amazing amount on music and entertainment. What's famous in places like India and certain parts of Africa is that people invest a lot in weddings and funerals, even though these are things that often don't have immediate value to them in terms of their potential income and so on. So once again, technology magnifies intent, but it's not necessarily the case that we have a good grasp of what human intent is. All right, next question. It's a series of questions. Okay, how many people believe that the army of whatever country you're from should have guns? Members of the army should have guns. Okay, most people are raising your hand. Can you keep your hands raised until you want to answer no? Okay, so next one. Should police officers have guns? Okay, most people still holding their hands up. Should ordinary civilians have guns? Okay, a few hands went down. Okay, some hands are still up. Should 5-year-old children have guns? Okay, most hands are down. Okay, sometimes I get people with their hands still up. And then, should convicted serial murderers have guns? Okay, so far I have not had anyone keep their hand up for this last question. Now, technology is the same in all of these, right? And what I'm trying to bring out in this question is that there are positive uses of guns and there are negative uses of guns, and we're less likely to entrust the positive use to people. We're less likely to entrust the technology to people that we think with high probability will end up using it for negative purposes, right? And the point I want to make is that technology's impact is not consistently positive, and this is true even if you do a study and find a positive impact of technology, right? So while I was in India, mobile phones just completely went bananas in the country. Already by the time I first got there, I found I couldn't do business without a mobile phone. And then second of all, during the time I was there, people started SMSing like crazy. They started sending MMS messages and so on. I'm sure a good portion of that communication was positive for the country in the sense of encouraging business and economics and so on. But at the same time, there were some negative impacts. So one of the big news stories that came out then was that occasionally, college students in compromising positions would end up having photos or videos of them spread all over the country through MMS. And this actually has demolished certain people's lives and so on and so forth. There was a movie that was made about this in India. So there's lots of negative consequences of spreading technology that we often ignore when we're looking for the positive instances. And so what I want to mention here is that technology magnifies both positive intent that human beings have and negative intent, especially if you're indiscriminately disseminating the technology. Okay, so to kind of put all of this together, here's the last question. This is a passage from a book, and the question for you is, what is X? And when was this passage written? So I'll read this out a little quickly. X has never been used to its full capacity in support of economic development. It may be financially impossible to use it in this way, but still the possibility is tantalizing. What is the full power and vividness of X teaching if it were to be used to help the schools develop a country's new educational pattern? What if the full persuasive and instructional power of X were to be used in support of community development and the modernization of farming? Where would the break-even point come? Where would the savings in rate of change catch up with the increased cost? Okay, what is X? Any ideas? TV? Anybody else? Computing? Anybody else? I heard chalkboard. Anything else?
Blackboard.
Blackboard? Anybody else? Laptop? Okay, all good answers. Eric's correct. It's TV. Okay, when? What year was this written? 1960s, yeah, good. Of course, this is why you're running the tier group. Okay, so this was written by a man, Wilbur Schramm, who's considered by many to be the father of the communications research, communication studies, and he was a co-founder of the communications department at Stanford. And you can see that there's a lot of, this discourse is actually almost identical to the conversation we are having now around PCs, and these days more and more around mobile phones. And what I want to point out is that all of this hope about television being used for education has not, in fact, come to pass. There are some positive impacts of television that people have measured. There are economic studies that show that, for example, women appear to become more empowered when they watch urban soap operas. They seem to absorb some of the cultural values that occur in cities, even though they're out in villages. There are some places where you can show that certain awareness about the modern world has definitely increased, and so on and so forth. But on the whole, the value of TV for education has really not happened. You can go into very poor villages across the world and find households with TVs, find entire villages watching TV, and yet illiteracy remains high, educational levels remain low. Over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, there's been experiments around what are called telecenters, where the idea is to take PCs to rural communities, connect them to the internet, and see if you can do something that provides some social value to those communities. And largely, they have not had the impact that was initially sought, nor have they been sustainable from a financial perspective. So as I mentioned today, the question is with the mobile phone. In fact, there's something very interesting about the mobile phone, which is that at this point, there are over 5 billion active mobile phone accounts in the world. Over 90% of the population is within range of a cell phone tower, and you can go to some very, very remote rural villages in the world and find people with mobile phones. But my claim is that although mobile phones certainly have certain positive impacts, that it's not necessarily clear on the whole that they're necessarily going to solve poverty despite all of their value. So some of this may seem obvious. In fact, when I give this talk to people who are not involved in technology for development projects, they always say, oh, this seems so obvious. Why are you even telling us all this? But I want to remind you that very prominent people in this community actually are putting out rhetoric that is exactly the opposite. So for example, the first one is by Nicholas Negroponte, who, as many of you know, runs a project called One Laptop Per Child. And the rhetoric in that project is that if you simply buy a laptop for every child in the world, they will all get educated. Okay? And he's taken sufficiently seriously that people like Kofi Annan, who used to be the Secretary General of the UN, have been on stage basically publicly promoting this idea. Negroponte is still pushing this idea as far as he can. In some places, it has caught on to the point where governments of Peru and Uruguay have invested a huge amount of money to actually buy hundreds of thousands of laptops that they conceivably could have used for something else. So what I want to go through is why this overall idea doesn't work as an interventionist project in ICT4D. So one of the kinds of problems that people often encounter is that they'll find a very poor farmer, and they say, okay, this farmer does not have all the information he or she needs to do their work. So let's connect them somehow with an expert. And in an earlier phase of this kind of work, people said, okay, let's give each side a computer, connect them through the internet, and magic will happen. And then what we've realized over time is that that's not necessarily the case. The farmer may not have the education and the literacy required to really make use of the internet. If any kind of money needs to change hands, as often does, then the farmer is not in an electronic banking system, doesn't have a line of credit, et cetera. If any kind of physical goods needs to change hands, there's issues with transport costs. And oftentimes, there are things that the farmer himself is not immediately able to do. So for example, if he wants to sell his products on an international market, he needs to attend to quality assurance, which tends to be something that it takes a lot of time to learn, a lot of effort to learn. So just providing the device and the connectivity isn't enough. Okay? Similarly, for e-commerce, let's say you have somebody who's selling crafts. Okay? And people immediately think, oh, we can put this on the international market and get a lot more money for the craftsperson. Okay? Same problems. So again, the technology alone is not enough. Okay, telemedicine. Let's say we have a situation where you want to provide medical services to people in the remote areas. Doctors don't want to go there, so all we have to do is connect the urban doctors to rural patients. Okay, same problems over and over and over again. These days, this conversation is now happening around mobile phones. Now, there is something interesting about mobile phones, there's no doubt. They're much more portable, they're cheaper. People have them even though they want them without any other purpose other than to be able to talk to their friends and family. These days, you can send money over the mobile phone. So a lot of these things will certainly change the game a little bit, but the underlying issues are still going to remain. Now, there are plenty of successes in technology for development. And the tier group here has done one of them, which is to provide long-distance wireless so that rural health clinics can communicate with urban hospitals and actually provide specialized services for eye care. And there are other examples where, for example, you can have women who effectively act as mobile phone booths and go door to door and sell phone services, and it actually increases their income and allows an entire village to have phone service and so on and so forth. So there are things that actually work. So the question is, what is the secret sauce behind all of these projects? And my claim is that it is human capacity, human intent. Okay, so there's a phrase called the digital divide. This is my conception of what the digital divide looks like. Okay? Now, in the developed world, or what you really need to bridge this gap is a whole lot of different components. Okay? Only one of which is the digital technological component. Okay? And in the developed world, you have all of these other things. Okay? All of us in this room take these other things for granted. We have education, we have credit cards, we have bank accounts, we have access to the internet, so on. And so when an eBay or an Amazon comes along, we can take advantage of it right away, and we immediately see the value of that technology. Okay? Sometimes we take that little bit and assume that it is the primary cause for the positive value that we get. But the reality in much of the developing world is that you don't have all of those other factors in place, at least not to the extent that it would actually matter when you deliver something with a digital component. And so just providing the technology alone isn't really sufficient. Okay, so what do you do? Again, the summary of everything that I've been saying is that technology magnifies human intent and capacity. It might be individual human intent, it might be institutional intent. And so for technology, the problem is that you actually need the human intent there to actually make the technology work, number one. If you're working on a project that is to try to get technology to work in a certain place, then what you want is to work with partners who are willing to provide all of the other components so that the technology has a chance to work. And again, using the Wi-Fi project here as an example, the project works because they work with a partner that is an eye hospital that is fundamentally devoted to ensuring that they do rural outreach, they build rural healthcare clinics, they have staff in the rural areas that are willing to connect to human beings on an individual basis. So going back to the project I mentioned at the beginning, if the takeaway from that particular project is not that these digital slates are the magic, right? It's not that the digital slates, if you spread digital slates everywhere, that microfinance will suddenly get cheaper. It's that if you have a working microfinance institution in place, then the technology will magnify what they can do, accelerate what they do, make what they do more efficient. In this particular case, we worked with an organization called Pradhan, which is actually one of India's most competent nonprofit organizations. They work hard to establish a certain amount of rapport with rural villages, and their constant methodology is to try to get as much of the competence to happen within the village itself so that eventually they can walk away. All right, so I want to spend a few moments discussing why these myths persist. Okay, so once again, here's an overview. Okay, it's interesting again that the language of needs and rights is being used in this area for technology. Okay, even though that's not necessarily obvious. But I want to suggest that all of this inherits from a particular line of rhetoric that is very familiar to all of us, and that is what we say in the United States and other developed countries about technology. Okay, so here are some headlines. Okay, Twitter is changing the way we live. Okay, the internet democratizes access to information. Another one, each of us is simultaneously an individual person and a global publisher. Okay, I've been trying to write a blog, but it's not at all clear to me that I am a global publisher. So all of these things depend on fundamental intent and capacity in the background, on other social factors that have nothing to do with the technology themselves. Now, one thing that's really interesting is to see whether or not any of this is really changing the face of poverty, even in developed countries like the United States. Okay, so here is a graph from the US Census showing the rate of poverty in the United States, and you can see it declined until about 1970s, and then since then it's been a roughly static 13% until the recent recession when it actually went up. Okay? Now, since the 1970s, it also happens that some of the amazing technological inventions that we're all talking about have happened, right? I mean, the internet is everywhere. Everyone has a mobile phone. Companies like Google are household names, right? So think about this for a moment. If in the golden age of innovation, in the country that is the most technologically advanced, right, you don't see all of this fantastic technology making a dent in poverty, then you have to ask the question, maybe technology isn't the solution to this particular problem. It might help, but it's certainly not the fundamental issue. Personally, I think what the problem in this case is that the United States, as a country, is not sufficiently vested in eliminating poverty. All right, so to summarize, I talked about 5 myths of technology for development. The first one being that technology counteracts the phenomenon of the rich getting richer. The second myth, that information is the bottleneck. Number 3, that needs are more pressing than desires. Fourth, that technology's impact is necessarily positive. And fifth, that technology X will save the world. Okay? And the conclusion overall is that technology is a magnifier of human and institutional intent and capacity. And the recommendation for people who are doing projects with technology is to make sure that you look for institutions that are already accomplishing the positive development impact that you want, and then to see if you can use technology to help those organizations rather than necessarily rushing in headlong with the technology itself. Thank you. Yeah, question?
So, maybe I missed this if it was interpreted. What does ICT stand for?
Oh, sorry, that's my fault. You didn't miss it. ICT stands for Information and Communication Technologies. And it's a phrase it's an acronym that's often used for computers, any digital devices, the internet, basically modern electronic technology. Yes.
Yeah, I wonder, do you have an explanation for the fact that if you look at the field of development communication over the last 50, 60 years, it seems to fall into the same trap again and again and again. It started when the radio was introduced in the 50s, there was big expectations. It always ends up to become a very hardware-driven approach, a technology-centered approach, which looks for the solution in the technology instead of having an approach which is driven by the aims and objectives of the civil society organizations, donor organizations, and the like, and link it to their communication strategy and say, oh, where could we use the new technology, and why is it? Why is this field unable to merge and make mistakes again?
No, that's a great question. I actually think that the development community as a whole is very slowly learning these things, but it's very slow. One reason why I think some of the learning doesn't happen is that there's actually not a group of people, a fixed group of people that constitutes the field. And so what happens is you get people who are constantly entering and leaving, and the people who constantly enter, and I'm myself guilty of this, are people who, when they first start, have no knowledge of any of the history that's happened until then. And so a good amount of the problem is that people are reinventing the wheel and reinventing understanding of how these things work. The other is that I think there's a certain amount of just natural human fascination with technology, which on the whole is a good thing, but I mean it permeates this area. It's interesting that a lot of the hype doesn't even come from technologists, even though technologists are certainly guilty of a lot of it. It comes from people who are every day working on development projects, and then when they hear about a new technology, they get excited and think that it might be able to help them. So there's lots of different factors. Any other questions?
You emphasize the need to work with institutions, competent institutions that are familiar with what the actual problems are. But it seems like a lot of the successes are actually, in some sense, empowering individuals to overcome institutions, whether they be corrupt governments or money lenders, brokers who, for mobile banking, for example, monopolize savings accounts and things of that sort.
Right. So yeah, the question is, I emphasize working with competent institutions, but what about those situations where individuals are being empowered? So I should clarify a few things. One is that I use the word institution deliberately, not to mean necessarily organizations, but human inclinations. So in certain cases, there are individual tendencies that you can actually track and find. The one example that I gave on this list that is a positive instance. Oops, where is it? Is M-Pesa, where people are exchanging money over their mobile phone and sending back income they earn in urban areas to rural areas. But what I want to emphasize is that that phenomenon was already happening without the mobile phone. So people would take money back home, and the mobile phone allowed them to do it more easily. But some of the other things that you mentioned are actually explicitly not on here because if on closer examination, they are not having the impact that you're implying. So for example, a lot of cases people think, oh, Twitter is changing, the way that the revolution is happening in Iran. If you talk to people like Evgeny Morozov at Stanford, they'll say that actually all that's happened is that the West is better able to get the news coming out of Iran, but that people in Iran are no better organized with Twitter than without Twitter. So a lot of this is really, there's a lot of myth-making that happens. A lot of it is generated by the press around what technology does to transform global movements.
I was wondering if you could comment on the kind of the Easterly statement about searching for solutions, which I think kind of fits with what you're saying, versus kind of the.
I think I'm not sure that I align on either side of that question. So, Bill Easterly talks about searching versus planning, and he's very against top-down planning, and he's much more for localized searching. But I would say, China has done a pretty good job with top-down planning on a lot of things. I don't think it's fundamentally a question of planning or searching. It's really how competently that, whatever it is that's being implemented is actually being implemented. So top-down often doesn't work if your institutions are not ready to take whatever it is that you're trying to push top-down. And sometimes people do push, programs that are really not appropriate for, whatever the community is. So all of those problems are there. But I think, I think a lot of this discussion around technology is kind of, orthogonal to those questions in that, I've seen small-scale projects that are doing everything they can to try to use technology in the right way, still not work, as well as large-scale projects that don't work, and also small-scale projects that work, and large-scale projects like M-Pesa and some of these that actually do work. So it's an interesting question. I'm not sure that the line is being drawn the right way.
I wanted to follow up on the point that you made about that a lot of folks that work in ICT4D, just like any other international development, are come in new as outsiders, which is common throughout every area of international development. Is there are all these good intentions but a lot of people trying to do this work that really don't have the experience and the background to understand their users or the potential community that they're trying to influence. One thing that might be changing when I look at particularly at ICT is that in countries like India, you have a lot of innovation that used to be happening in the West trying to be applied to the global South, or the North and the global South. But now that innovation is actually starting to occur in India, there's still a huge gap between the educated, middle and upper class folks in India and the lower income communities that we're also trying to impact. But do you see, having spent all the time in India, do you see that might start to change things, that the source of innovation might actually start occurring among the populations that we're trying to impact?
So I think the question is whether a change in the location of the source of innovation makes a difference. I definitely believe that, but more because the change is happening in the cause of what's causing the innovation. So innovation requires a reasonable amount of education and entrepreneurial culture and a few other things, all of which are amazingly absent if you go into villages that are literally just struggling to survive. And it's not their fault. When you're struggling to survive, you're not going to be worried about how you can invent a new tractor system to till your field, because it's going to take you years and years to develop that, whereas you need to feed your family tomorrow. So I agree that the switch where the source of innovation is happening is a good indicator that something right is happening. It usually means that the educational system has picked up a little bit and that the local capacity has developed to the point where they can actually innovate for themselves. I think a lot of our emphasis is on these superficial things like innovation. And so what happens is you get entire projects on trying to start innovation somewhere when they're not looking at the underlying foundation that's necessary just to get innovation to happen.
Okay.
So just going to your graph on the technology in the U.S.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you talk about is technology amplifying capacity and intent. And I think there's no doubt that capacity exists in the US to, for example, solve some of these problems, including poverty. So clearly, according to your view, in this case, the problem is intent, right? And there are, I mean, I think we can't argue that there aren't people that are actually putting good work into solving these problems, and these technologies came around and they were applied, but ultimately nothing changed, right? So there needs to be something different to bring sustainable change, and something that would in some ways create critical mass that would tip the scale and change society as a whole, right? Do you have an opinion on what that is?
That is a tough question. I don't have an easy answer, but to kind of address some of the things that you mentioned. So in the United States, the problem is that the people who are under this line of the poverty rate are both again struggling to survive and often will lack the means, both educational and social and so on, to actually be able to pull themselves out of that situation, right? Otherwise, they would have long have done it. Meanwhile, the people who are, who have the capacity to change these things, I mean, this is what I see, but it's amazing to me that we put so much emphasis around the latest new gadget that comes up, right? It is not changing the underlying social structure in this country, and I think we're constantly distracted by it. We're distracted by new technologies. They affect us in a very positive way. They're fun toys, but they're not really, forcing us to look at some of the larger challenges in the country, and so that constantly, is taking up more space in the newspapers than I think is worthwhile.
One more last. Going back to your examples for success, I found it interesting that M-Pesa, it stands out in a way, because M-Pesa, the other example seem to be all donor-driven, like the telecenter approach or the community information center approach mainly becomes realized by money from governments, by donor agencies, multilateral, bilateral. But the M-Pesa is a market-driven example, and you could even argue whether it has been an ICT for development project or whether it just has been a good business with Safaricom introducing mobile banking. And for the average Kenyan person, instead of you have to spend half a day to go and pay your electricity bill every month, you can do it in 5 minutes at the next M-Pesa counter. So it's completely market-driven. And some people would argue that if it would have been up to the government to introduce that scheme, it would never probably have been realized. So what do you think about this trend, which is maybe it stands for going away from donor-driven ICT for development projects, and where's the limitations of market-driven examples like M-Pesa? Where is it not interesting to introduce it?
So I think the question is, market-driven versus donor or publicly driven development. That's another line that I think is unnecessarily drawn in this discussion. It's not that market-driven is good or bad. It's not that public is good or bad. There are projects that are good and bad on both sides. M-Pesa, I agree, is definitely very interesting. But again, there are both good and bad aspects to M-Pesa. It's not all good, even though that's typically what you read. The other thing that's often underestimated about M-Pesa is the degree to which Safaricom invested in building out a whole army of people who were able to do cash in and cash out that they could trust. And that process was incredibly time-consuming and effort-consuming. And in other countries where projects like M-Pesa have tried to go on, it's never been with the same level of success as in Kenya, and partly it's because that emphasis on that group was built. I think there is a tendency, especially with technology, to believe that everything ultimately has to be a business in order to succeed. But it's very clear that things like public education and healthcare, at least in some parts of the world, are better handled through the government, and there's no reason why we should necessarily try to find yet another way to do it, even though certainly if we can do it as a business, that's great. But inevitably what happens with businesses is you tend to cater to the richest people who can afford to pay. And what we're trying to do in development is to see how you can provide these services for people who fundamentally lack that capacity.
Do we have any last question? Okay, well, Please join me in thanking him for a great talk.
Thank you.